It started with a key. Not the kind of sleek plastic card we use today, but a real key, heavy, brass, and ornate. The kind that carried weight, both literal and otherwise. Its number, etched into the metal, read simply 307. The desk clerk, a wiry man with sunken eyes and a name tag that read Bill, had hesitated before handing it over. "You sure you don't want a room on the second floor?" he'd asked, voice low, almost conspiratorial. I'd laughed it off. "What's wrong with the third floor?" Bill didn't laugh back. "People don't usually ask for it. But if you insist," he slid the key across the counter, the look in his eyes saying more than his words ever could. The hotel itself was nothing remarkable, a relic of another era. Faded wallpaper, threadbare carpets, the faint smell of mildew that clung to the air like a ghost of every storm that had ever rolled through. It wasn't luxurious, but it was cheap, and after 8 hours on the road, cheap was all I cared about. Room 307 was at the end of a long, dimly lit hallway. The kind of hallway where every step echoed a fraction too loud, where shadows lingered just a second too long. The brass numbers on the door were tarnished, the edges worn smooth by decades of unknown hands. I slipped the key into the lock, the mechanism turning with a reluctant click. Inside, the room was fine. Beige walls, a bed that sagged in the middle, a window overlooking a parking lot that seemed emptier than it should have been. A television bolted to the wall stared blankly, its remote tethered by a coil of grimy plastic. It was the kind of room that made you acutely aware of how alone you were. But it wasn't the loneliness that unnerved me. Not at first. The first oddity was the temperature. No matter how much I fiddled with the thermostat, the room remained cold. Not just cool, cold. The kind that seeped into your bones and refused to leave. I shrugged it off, figuring the ancient heating system was just as tired as the rest of the building. Then came the noises. Faint, almost imperceptible at first. A creak from the ceiling, a soft scrape against the walls. Old buildings make noise, I told myself. Pipes settling, wood contracting. Perfectly normal. But when I lay down that night, it became impossible to ignore. The creaks turned into footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing above me. I was on the top floor. There was no room above mine. I tried to dismiss it, to rationalize the irrational. Maybe there was an attic. Maybe it was just my imagination. But the pacing didn't stop. It grew louder, heavier, until it felt like whatever, or whoever it was walking directly over my bed. I shot upright, heart pounding, and stared at the ceiling. The footsteps stopped. The next day, I mentioned it to Bill. He didn't look surprised. If anything, he looked resigned. "Must have been the pipes," he said, his voice flat, eyes avoiding mine. "Old building, you know. Lot of quirks." "Sure," I replied, though I didn't believe him. His hand trembled slightly as he typed something into the computer, and I noticed he avoided touching the key to room 307, now sitting in its slot on the wall behind him. That evening, I decided to investigate. I went up to the third floor during the day, when the sunlight spilling through the windows made the hallway seem almost cheerful. Almost. I knocked on the doors around room 307, hoping to find other guests who might have heard something. But door after door went unanswered. Either the rooms were empty, or their occupants didn't want to talk. Then I noticed something strange. The other doors had peepholes. Mine didn't. That night, the noises started earlier. The pacing, the creaking, the occasional muffled thud. But now, there was something else, a faint whispering. Indistinct, just on the edge of hearing, like a radio tuned to a dead station. I strained to make out the words, pressing my ear against the wall. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but still, I couldn't understand them. They weren't in English. They weren't in any language I recognized. Then the lights flickered. Once. Twice. And went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only illumination coming from the faint glow of the parking lot lights outside. I fumbled for my phone, the beam of its flashlight cutting through the blackness. That's when I saw it. The reflection in the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, perhaps, cast by the flickering bulb in the hallway. But the figure didn't move like a shadow. It stood there, motionless, its outline hazy but unmistakable. A man, or something shaped like a man, tall and gaunt, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I turned, heart hammering, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the window, the figure was gone. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night with the lights on, the TV playing infomercials at a low volume to keep the silence at bay. When morning finally came, I packed my bag, intent on checking out early. But when I went to the front desk, Bill was gone. In his place was a young woman with a strained smile and a name tag that read Megan. "Checking out?" she asked, her tone overly bright. "Yes," I said, sliding the key across the counter. I had some issues with the room. Megan's smile faltered. "Which room were you in?" 307. Her expression froze. For a moment, I thought she might laugh, but instead, she just stared at me, her face pale. "Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure," I snapped, irritation creeping into my voice. "Why?" She hesitated, then reached for a binder beneath the counter. Flipping through it, she stopped on a page and frowned. "There must be a mistake," she muttered, more to herself than to me. "What kind of mistake?" She glanced up, her eyes wide and uncertain. "Room 307 hasn't been in use for years. It's condemned." I left the hotel in a daze, my mind racing with questions and half-formed explanations. But as I drove away, one thing became clear: whatever had happened in room 307, it wasn't over. Because in the rearview mirror, I could see it. The figure. Watching. Waiting. I floored the gas pedal, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. The highway stretched ahead, an endless ribbon of asphalt under the pale morning light. I glanced at the rearview mirror again. Empty. For a moment, I let myself breathe, the rational part of my brain screaming to take control. Sleep deprivation, stress, maybe even a gas leak in the room, it could all explain what had happened. But deep down, I knew none of that was true. Because the cold had followed me. It began subtly, as things like this often do. The heater in my car worked just fine, but no matter how high I cranked it, the chill remained. The kind that sank deep, as if my very bones were encased in ice. I kept driving, telling myself it was just the after effects of the sleepless night. A few miles, a warm meal, and I'd be fine. Or so I thought. By the time I reached a roadside diner, my nerves were frayed. The place was straight out of a postcard: faded red booths, checkered floors, a waitress with a beehive hairdo pouring coffee like she was born doing it. I took a seat by the window, craving the simple comfort of normalcy. "What'll it be, hon?" the waitress asked, pen poised over her notepad. "Coffee. Black. And a stack of pancakes," I said, my voice hoarse. She nodded, her eyes lingering on me for just a second too long. I realized I must have looked like hell, disheveled, pale, and haunted. "Rough night?" she asked, a flicker of curiosity in her voice. "You could say that," I muttered, not meeting her gaze. When she left, I stared out the window. The parking lot was nearly empty, save for a few rusty pickups and an old station wagon. But something caught my eye, a shape, far off in the distance, standing at the edge of the tree line. It didn't move. The pancakes tasted like sawdust. The coffee, bitter and lukewarm, did little to steady my nerves. I glanced at my phone, desperate for some distraction, but the screen refused to light up. Dead battery. "Figures," I muttered under my breath. I asked the waitress for the check, but when she brought it, her face had changed. The cheerful, practiced smile was gone, replaced by something harder, more serious. "You were in room 307, weren't you?" she said, her voice low. I froze. How did you know that?" She slid into the booth across from me, ignoring the disapproving glance from a man behind the counter who must have been her boss. "People talk," she said, leaning closer. "About that place. About what happens there. I don't know what you're talking about, I lied. Her eyes narrowed. You don't have to pretend with me. I've heard the stories. People seeing things, hearing things. Room 307's been closed for years, but every so often, someone gets put in there. And they never leave the same. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. What kind of stories? She hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure no one else was listening. There was a man, years ago. A salesman, I think. He checked in, but he didn't check out. When the maid found him, she trailed off, her face pale. Was what? I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Gone. I mean, his body was there, but it wasn't him anymore. His eyes were wide open, staring at the ceiling, but they were empty. Like someone had scooped out his soul. I didn't wait to hear the rest. I threw a few bills on the table and bolted, the chill in the air now gnawing at the edges of my sanity. Back in the car, I locked the doors and sat there, gripping the steering wheel, my breath fogging up the glass. The figure was closer now. It stood in the parking lot, unmoving, its head still tilted at that impossible angle. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze. Heavy, oppressive, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I started the car, the engine roaring to life, and tore out of the parking lot. The figure didn't move, but in my rearview mirror, I swore I saw its shadow stretching, reaching, as if trying to follow me. The next few hours were a blur of endless roads and mounting dread. Every so often, I caught glimpses of it, standing by the side of the highway, lingering at a gas station, reflected in the darkened windows of abandoned buildings. No matter how far I drove, it was always there. Watching. By nightfall, I was too exhausted to continue. I pulled into a cheap motel, the neon sign buzzing faintly in the cold air. The clerk handed me a key without comment, and I trudged to my room, my limbs leaden with fatigue. Room 207. It wasn't 307, but the number still sent a shiver down my spine. I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed, hoping for a few hours of dreamless sleep. But dreams wouldn't come. The whispers started again, faint and indistinct, weaving through the fabric of my thoughts. The cold seeped into the room, and I knew, without looking, that it was there. Standing in the corner. I didn't move. Didn't breathe. The darkness felt alive, pressing in on all sides, suffocating me. Slowly, deliberately, the whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand but somehow knew were meant for me. Then the footsteps began. Slow, deliberate, crossing the room with a weight that made the floor creak. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away, that this was just some twisted nightmare. But the voice, it spoke, clear and undeniable, a low rasp that cut through the silence like a blade. You can't leave. Not yet. My eyes snapped open, and for a split second, I saw it. The figure loomed over me, its face, or what passed for a face, a void of writhing shadows. And then the lights flickered, and it was gone. But the door to room 207 was open. Waiting. I staggered out of the room, my heart hammering, the cold clinging to me like a second skin. The hallway stretched endlessly in both directions, the flickering bulbs casting distorted shadows on the walls. I ran. Down the hall, down the stairs, out into the freezing night air. My car was still there, thank God, and I threw myself into it, fumbling with the keys. As the engine roared to life, I glanced up. Room 307's window was lit. And in it, the figure stood, watching me leave. I drove until the horizon blurred, the road melting into darkness, the chill a relentless companion. I kept the radio off, static unnerved me now, and focused on the sound of the tires on asphalt, a constant rhythm to drown out the whispers echoing in my mind. But even the monotony of the drive couldn't keep it at bay. The memory of that voice. You can't leave. Not yet. What did it mean? My thoughts spiraled, twisting into knots of paranoia and dread. The diner waitress's words echoed in my ears. People didn't leave that room the same. I glanced at my reflection in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something other than my own face staring back. But it was me. Mostly. When I finally stopped, it was at another roadside motel, the kind where the neon sign flickers half dead and the clerk doesn't bother making eye contact. I paid in cash, not wanting to linger long enough for small talk. This time, I didn't check the room number. I didn't want to know. Inside, I double-locked the door, wedged the flimsy desk chair under the knob, and turned every light on. The room was bare, bed, nightstand, a cheap TV bolted to the wall, but it felt like a prison cell. I sat on the bed, my back against the headboard, clutching the motel's thin blanket like a shield. Sleep felt impossible, but exhaustion was a cruel master. My head dipped forward, and before I could fight it, I was out. I woke to the sound of scratching. Not at the door, but inside the room. My breath caught in my throat as my eyes darted to the source. The dresser. Something was inside it, clawing against the cheapwood like an animal trapped in a cage. The air turned colder, so cold my breath came out in invisible puffs. The light above flickered once, then twice, before plunging the room into darkness. The scratching stopped. And then, the whispering began again. This time, it was closer. My body was frozen, every instinct screaming to run, but I couldn't. I was a prisoner to my fear, paralyzed as the whispers grew louder, filling the room with their unintelligible chorus. The dresser creaked. The top drawer slid open, slow and deliberate, the sound like nails on a chalkboard. I couldn't see what was inside, but the darkness within seemed to pulse, alive and watching. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. "It's not over, you know." I gasped, my eyes darting around the room. It wasn't the same rasping voice from before. This one was lighter, almost conversational. "You thought you could just drive away?" it continued, a hint of amusement in its tone. "That's not how this works." "Who are you?" I managed to croak, my throat dry and raw. The voice chuckled, low and humorless. "That's the wrong question. The right question is, why did you stop?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. My mind was spinning, desperately searching for some shred of logic, some way to make sense of the nightmare I was trapped in. "You can't leave room 307, it said, its tone growing darker. "Not really. It stays with you. Always." The dresser drawer slammed shut, the sound reverberating through the room like a gunshot. The lights flickered back on, and the whispers stopped. But the cold, it remained. I didn't stay to see what came next. I grabbed my keys and bolted, not caring that I left my bag behind. Outside, the night was impossibly silent, the air heavy with an oppressive stillness. My car sat alone in the parking lot, a lifeline in the suffocating darkness. As I reached it, I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned, slowly, against every screaming instinct. The motel's windows stared back, blank and lifeless. Except for one. The light in my room was on. And in the window, a shadow moved. I didn't sleep again after that. Days blurred into nights as I drove, endlessly searching for somewhere that felt safe. But safety was a memory now, something I could no longer touch. The cold followed me, a silent predator, gnawing at my sanity with each passing mile. I began to notice things. The faint whispers in my rearview mirror, fleeting shadows in the corners of my vision. The headlights of oncoming cars seemed too bright, their drivers' faces indistinct and wrong. And always, the feeling that I wasn't alone. I tried to tell myself it was all in my head, that I was imagining it. But deep down, I knew better. Because when I finally worked up the courage to check my rearview mirror again, I saw it. Sitting in the back seat. Waiting. My breath hitched, caught between a scream and silence. The figure sat perfectly still, its form barely visible in the dim light of the dashboard. No face, no features, just the overwhelming presence. My grip on the steering wheel tightened, my knuckles white as I tried to focus on the road ahead. It didn't move. But it didn't need to. The air grew impossibly colder, frost creeping along the inside of the windows despite the heater blasting at full power. I could feel it, its gaze boring into the back of my skull, silent and unyielding. "You can't keep running," it said, the voice low and guttural, reverberating inside my chest like a second heartbeat. My jaw clenched, and I forced my eyes to stay forward. "What do you want from me?" I demanded, my voice cracking. It didn't answer. Instead, it leaned forward, slowly, deliberately, until I could feel its icy breath on the back of my neck. "You checked in," it whispered, "but you never checked out." The car swerved as I jerked the wheel, adrenaline surging through my veins. I pulled over to the side of the road, gravel crunching under the tires, and threw the door open, stumbling out into the night. The cold followed me, wrapping around me like a second skin. I turned, half expecting to see the figure standing by the car, but it was empty. The back seat, the dashboard, nothing but shadows. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought it was over. But then the radio crackled to life. I hadn't turned it on. The static was deafening, a cacophony of white noise that made my ears ring. And then, through the chaos, a voice emerged. "You can't escape it," it said, distorted and echoing. "You're part of it now." I backed away from the car, my chest heaving, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The headlights flickered, then died, plunging the stretch of road into darkness. And that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the shadows just beyond the reach of the moonlight. Watching. Waiting. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. The figures didn't move, but their presence was suffocating, their collective gaze a weight that pressed down on me from all sides. The whispers started again, louder this time, a chorus of voices speaking in unison. "Room 307 is not a place. It's a doorway." "A doorway to what?" I shouted, my voice breaking. The figures remained silent, their shadows shifting like smoke. But the whispers continued, threading through my thoughts like barbed wire. "Once you've crossed the threshold, you belong to it." I stumbled backward, my mind racing. This couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of hallucination, a nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But no matter how much I tried to rationalize it, the truth was undeniable. I had crossed a line, and there was no going back. I ran. The road stretched endlessly before me, the darkened figures fading into the distance as I sprinted into the night. My chest burned, my lungs screaming for air, but I didn't stop. Couldn't stop. The whispers followed me, growing louder with each step. They weren't just in my head anymore, they were everywhere, in the rustling of the wind, the crunch of gravel underfoot, the hollow echo of my footsteps. "You can't run forever," they taunted, their voices dripping with malice. But I tried anyway. By the time I collapsed, my legs refusing to carry me any further, the sky was beginning to lighten. Dawn crept over the horizon, painting the world in muted hues of gray and gold. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the whispers stopped. I lay there, trembling, the cold still clinging to me but no longer suffocating. The figures were gone, the road empty. For the first time, I thought I might be free. But as I pulled myself to my feet, a single thought crept into my mind, unbidden and unwelcome. The cold hadn't left me. It never would. And that's when I realized the truth. Room 307 wasn't a place you left behind. It wasn't a nightmare you could wake up from. It was a part of me now. Forever. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. It wasn't the room that haunted me, it was something deeper. Something that had wormed its way inside my very being. I stood there, swaying on shaky legs, staring down the empty road. The world was quiet, deceptively calm, but the cold clung to me like a parasite. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket, pulling out my phone. I hadn't dared use it in days, afraid of what I might hear. The screen flickered as it came to life, the signal weak but there. I hesitated before dialing the first number that came to mind, my brother. He'd always been the rational one, the fixer. If anyone could help me make sense of this, it was him. The phone rang once. Twice. Then, a click. Hello? His voice was distant, muffled, like he was speaking through a thick wall. Jake, it's me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. There was a long pause. Then, a soft chuckle. Is it really you? My blood turned to ice. What kind of question is that? The chuckle grew louder, morphing into something cruel and mocking. You sound different, he said. Not quite yourself. But I guess that's to be expected, isn't it? After all, you checked in. I dropped the phone, my heart hammering in my chest. The screen went dark as it hit the ground, the faint sound of static still leaking from the speaker. I should have left the phone there, abandoned it like the rest of my life. But something made me pick it up, the faint hope that maybe I imagined it all. Maybe Jake hadn't said those words. Maybe I was just cracking under the pressure. But as I held the phone in my trembling hands, the screen lit up again. One new notification. A message. I didn't want to open it. Every instinct screamed to throw the phone into the ditch and walk away. But my fingers moved on their own, tapping the screen, dragging me deeper into the nightmare. The message was simple. A single image. Room 307. The photo was too vivid, too real. The faded wallpaper, the stained carpet, the warped dresser, every detail burned into my mind like a brand. And in the corner of the room, just barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. It wasn't a person. Not exactly. Its shape was human, but its proportions were all wrong, arms too long, head tilted at an impossible angle. Its face was obscured, but I could feel its eyes on me, boring into my soul even through the screen. My phone buzzed again. Another message. This time, it was text. Come back. My stomach churned, bile rising in my throat. I shoved the phone into my pocket, as if that would make it go away. But the cold pressed harder, tighter, like a vice around my chest. It wasn't just a message. It was a summons. I tried to fight it, to ignore the pull dragging me back to that cursed room. But every step I took felt heavier, like walking through quicksand. The road seemed to stretch on forever, each mile blending into the next until I wasn't sure if I was moving forward or circling back. The whispers returned, soft at first, like a breeze brushing against my ear. You can't escape. You belong to us now. Room 307 is waiting. I clenched my teeth, forcing myself to keep walking, to focus on the faint light of the horizon. But the world around me grew darker, the shadows lengthening and twisting, reaching for me with clawed hands. And then, I saw it. The motel. It shouldn't have been there. I had driven hundreds of miles, crossed state lines, left it far behind. But there it stood, as if it had never moved. The neon sign buzzed faintly, the same letters missing, the same flickering glow casting eerie patterns on the cracked pavement. Room 307's light was on. I didn't remember walking to the door, but suddenly, I was there, the cold seeping through the wood like a living thing. My hand hovered over the doorknob, shaking, the urge to run clashing with the invisible force compelling me to stay. You came back, the voice whispered, no longer mocking. It was pleased. The door creaked open on its own, revealing the room inside. Empty. But it wasn't. Because I was already there. My reflection stared back at me, sitting on the edge of the bed, its head tilted in that same unnatural angle as the figure in the photo. Its eyes, my eyes, were hollow, dark voids that seemed to swallow the light. You checked in, it said, its voice a perfect echo of my own. And now you can never leave. I stumbled back, the air ripped from my lungs, but the door slammed shut behind me. The walls closed in, the cold consuming everything, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. And then, nothing. Nothing but silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, there were no whispers, no voices in my head, no icy breath at my neck. Just silence. I opened my eyes, unsure if I closed them. The room was empty, eerily still, but something was different. The air felt heavy, charged, like the seconds before a lightning strike. The reflection was gone. Or maybe it had never been there at all. I glanced around, heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of where I was. The walls were the same faded yellow, the carpet still worn and stained, but the details were wrong. The angles were sharper, the shadows deeper. It was room 307, but it wasn't. And then I heard it. A knock. Soft at first, barely audible, like a polite guest tapping on the door. But it grew louder, harder, more insistent, until it was pounding, shaking the entire room. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The door rattled in its frame, the sound echoing like thunder, each knock reverberating in my chest. And then it stopped. "Let me in," a voice said, muffled and distant. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the doorknob began to turn, slowly, deliberately, the metal creaking under an invisible hand. "No," I said, louder this time. "Stay out." But the door swung open anyway. There was nothing there. Just the empty hallway stretching into darkness. But the air was colder now, heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay. And then I saw it. A figure, standing at the end of the hallway, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't move, didn't speak, but I could feel its presence, oppressive and all-consuming. The whispers returned, louder than ever, a cacophony of voices overlapping and intertwining until I couldn't tell where one ended and another began. "Don't fight it," they said. "It's already too late." I stumbled back, my legs giving out beneath me, and fell to the floor. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, each step echoing like a gunshot in the silence. It stopped just short of the doorway, its form obscured by the darkness. But I could feel it watching me, its gaze piercing through the shadows. And then it spoke. "You should have never checked in." The words hit me like a physical blow, the weight of them crushing the air from my lungs. I scrambled back, dragging myself across the floor, desperate to put as much distance between us as possible. But the room had changed again. The walls were no longer faded and peeling. They were alive, pulsing and writhing like something out of a nightmare. The floor beneath me was cold, wet, and sticky, and the faint smell of iron filled the air. The whispers grew louder, the voices overlapping until they were one deafening scream. "Stay." The figure stepped into the room, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was my face. Twisted, distorted, a grotesque mockery of myself. Its hollow eyes bore into mine, and I realized, with sickening clarity, that it wasn't just wearing my face, it was me. Or what was left of me. "You can't leave," it said, its voice a perfect echo of my own. "You're part of this now. Part of us." I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't want this. But you chose it," it said, stepping closer. "The moment you walked through that door, you made your choice. And now, there's no escape." It reached out, its hand cold and clammy, and gripped my wrist. The touch burned like ice, sending searing pain up my arm. I tried to pull away, but its grip was unyielding, its strength far beyond anything human. "You belong here," it said, its voice soft, almost gentle. "Forever." And as it pulled me closer, the walls closed in, the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo, and the room swallowed me whole. To this day, I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't work the same way in room 307. I see faces sometimes, reflected in the cracked mirror or the smudged window. They're always familiar, always haunting. But the worst part? I'm not alone. I hear them, the others who've checked in and never left. Their whispers echo through the walls, their footsteps shuffle in the darkness. And I know that someday, someone else will walk through that door, just like I did. And when they do, I'll be waiting. Because room 307 always needs another guest. The waiting is the worst part. Time stretches thin in room 307, slipping through my fingers like grains of sand. Sometimes, it feels like minutes, other times, centuries. The silence hums, oppressive and alive, pressing against my skull. I hear the faint echoes of footsteps in the hallway, the shuffle of movement, but no one ever comes. Not until the room decides it's ready. I've tried to escape, of course. Everyone does it first. The door only leads back inside, the window opens to nothing but a yawning void, and the walls, they're not walls at all. Once, in desperation, I clawed at the peeling wallpaper until my nails broke and bled. Beneath it, there was no plaster or wood, just something black and slick, pulsing faintly under my touch, like it was alive. And maybe it is. Room 307 isn't a place. It's a hunger. It doesn't let you rest. The room plays tricks, digging into your mind, showing you things you wish you'd forgotten or wish you could forget. My family's faces blur in and out of the cracked mirror, their voices calling my name, distorted and warped. Sometimes, I hear laughter. Other times, screaming. The room remembers everything. It dredges up every mistake, every regret, every moment you tried to bury deep inside yourself. And it doesn't let you look away. Once, it showed me the night my mother died. The sterile hospital room, the beep of machines, the way her hand went slack in mine. I'd spent years convincing myself I did everything I could, but the room knew better. You didn't visit enough, it whispered. You weren't there when she needed you most. I screamed at it to stop, to leave me alone. But the room only laughed. It enjoys your suffering. And yet, it's not always torment. There are moments, fleeting, cruel moments, when the room gives you a taste of what you've lost. I woke up one day to the smell of coffee, rich and warm, the way my dad used to make it on Saturday mornings. For a moment, I forgot where I was, the weight of the room lifting just enough to let me breathe. When I opened my eyes, the room was different. Brighter. The sun streamed through the window, casting golden light across the bedspread. I heard laughter, real, genuine laughter, from the hallway, and the scent of bacon frying wafted in under the door. It was my childhood home, down to the smallest detail. I ran to the door, flinging it open, desperate to see my family again. But the hallway wasn't my hallway. It was still the motel, dark and endless, the laughter fading into silence. The room had lied to me. It always does. I don't know how many others have been here before me, but I feel them everywhere. Their whispers seep through the walls, their footsteps echo in the shadows. I've seen them, brief glimpses, out of the corner of my eye. Pale, hollow-eyed figures lurking just beyond the edge of the light. They don't speak. Not directly. But I can feel their despair, their anger, their hunger. The room keeps us all here, trapped together but utterly alone. Sometimes, I wonder if I'll become one of them, another shadow, another whisper. Maybe I already am. The door opened yesterday. It hadn't opened in what felt like years. I was sitting on the bed, staring at the warped ceiling, when I heard the faint click of the lock. At first, I thought I'd imagined it. But then the door creaked open, revealing the hallway beyond. Someone was standing there. A man, mid-40s, wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a worn leather briefcase. He looked nervous, his eyes darting around like he wasn't sure where he was. I wanted to warn him. To shout, to tell him to turn around and run. But I couldn't. The room wouldn't let me. He stepped inside, his footsteps hesitant, and the door slammed shut behind him. I watched as he looked around, confusion turning to unease. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But his voice echoed back at him, empty and hollow. I stayed hidden, crouched in the corner, my breath shallow and silent. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid he'd see me for what I'd become. Or maybe I was afraid of what the room would do to him. It didn't take long for him to feel it, the cold, the weight of the air pressing down on him. His expression shifted, panic flickering in his eyes as he tried the door. It wouldn't budge. Of course it wouldn't. He stayed in the room for what felt like hours, pacing, muttering to himself, trying to make sense of it all. And then, the whispers started. His head snapped up, his eyes darting around the room. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. But there was no answer. Not one he could understand, anyway. The room was speaking to him now, digging into his mind, finding his cracks and prying them open. I could see it happening, the way his shoulders slumped, his hands shaking as he pressed them to his temples. "No," he whispered over and over. "No, that's not true. That's not true. But the room doesn't lie. It shows you the truth you've spent your whole life running from." I wanted to help him, to tell him it would be okay, even if it was a lie. But the room held me back, its invisible chains tightening around my chest. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the whispers stopped. The man turned to me, his eyes wide and haunted. "Why didn't you warn me?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. I didn't have an answer. Because there isn't one. Room 307 doesn't let you warn anyone. It doesn't let you save anyone. All it does is keep you. And soon, it'll keep him too. The room shifted again. This time, the air felt colder, heavier, like it was thickening around me. The shadows stretched long and strange, twisting into shapes I couldn't quite understand. They didn't make sense, these darkened outlines of things that couldn't exist. It was as if the room was trying to show me something I wasn't meant to see. But I couldn't turn away. The man, the newcomer, was sitting on the floor now, his back against the wall. His eyes were wide, staring at nothing. He didn't move, didn't speak. The only sound in the room was the soft thud of his breathing, slow and labored, like he was losing the fight to keep himself together. I could feel the weight of his fear pressing down on me. It was suffocating. I felt like I couldn't breathe, like the walls were closing in tighter, each breath a little harder to draw. The room was feeding on his terror, and I could feel it working its way into my chest, sinking deep into my bones. I wanted to scream. I wanted to shout at him to stop looking at me, to stop looking at the space between us where there should be no connection, no awareness. But there was nothing I could do. I was trapped, just like him, bound by the same unseen chains. The whispers rose again, swirling around the room, louder this time, almost deafening. They seemed to come from every direction, from the walls, the ceiling, the floor. The sound of my name, the others' names, all crashing together in a torrent of chaos. I couldn't tell where one voice ended and another began. "You're already gone," they said, over and over. "You've always been gone. You'll never leave." The newcomer's eyes fluttered open. They were wide, unblinking, unseeing. He looked right at me, but his gaze was empty, hollow. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking through me. Then he spoke. "I've been here before." His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. But there was a weight to it, a strange familiarity that made my skin crawl. I recoiled, as if the words had a physical presence, but they hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I couldn't breathe, couldn't speak. I tried to move, to run, but my limbs were frozen, like they were anchored to the floor. He smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was a knowing smile, like someone who had seen the worst, someone who had already walked this path to the end and come back to torment those who hadn't. "I know this place," he said, his voice slow and deliberate. "It's all a lie, you know. Room 307 isn't real. It's not a hotel. Not a room. It's just a prison. A prison for the mind." I stared at him, a chill running down my spine. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" He laughed, a hollow, empty laugh that echoed in the room, bouncing off the walls like a nightmare that wouldn't end. "It's not just the room, it's you." He pointed a shaking finger at me. "You're already gone. This is where the lost go when there's nothing left. It's where we go." The truth hit me like a punch to the gut. I had been avoiding it, denying it, for as long as I could. But now, there was no escape. The room was already claiming him, just as it had claimed me. Just as it had claimed everyone else who had ever stepped into its grip. I had a moment of clarity, a brief second where everything made sense. And then, just as quickly, the moment was gone, slipping through my fingers like sand. "Why didn't you warn me?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. He didn't answer. Instead, he stood up suddenly, moving with unnatural speed. His eyes were glazed, his face slack with terror. He staggered toward the door, reaching for the handle, as if the outside world were just a few steps away, as if the exit was real, was possible. But it wasn't. The door didn't open. Of course it didn't. The room didn't let anyone leave. He jerked at the handle, then started to pound on the door, yelling, screaming for someone, anyone, to help him. But the walls didn't care. The room didn't care. And then the door didn't just stay closed. It disappeared. It faded away into nothing, leaving only a blank, featureless wall behind it. The man froze, his mouth hanging open in disbelief. His eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere left to run, nowhere left to hide. In that moment, I knew it wasn't just the walls that were closing in. It was the room itself, the space between the walls, the very air itself, drawing tighter, suffocating us, making sure we stayed, making sure we never left. The room was a monster, a living, breathing entity, and we were its prey. We were trapped in its hunger. Hours passed, or maybe days. Time doesn't exist in room 307. It doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is the feeling, the sensation that you're being watched, followed, hunted. I had started to think that maybe, just maybe, the man had already been here longer than me. Maybe he was the one who had caused it all. Maybe it wasn't me. Maybe it was always him. But then, the whispers returned. They always return. You've made your choice, they said. You belong here now. And I felt it, the shift. The suffocating weight of the room as it tightened its grip around me again. But this time, I wasn't the only one. The man was still pacing, still muttering to himself, his eyes wide with a madness that was starting to reflect my own. He had broken, just like everyone else before him. His soul was unraveling, the threads of his mind snapping one by one. He was no longer just a visitor, he was part of the room now. And I was next. I don't know how long we stayed like this, locked in the prison of room 307. My body ached from the strain of remaining conscious, my mind barely clinging to the last remnants of rational thought. But through it all, I knew something. I knew there was no end. The room doesn't end. It just keeps pulling you deeper. And when you've fallen far enough, you'll forget what it was like to be free. You'll forget what it was like to leave. It happened quietly, almost imperceptibly, but I felt it. 1 minute, I was trapped in that haze of fear, my thoughts fraying at the edges, and the next, there was a distinct shift in the air. A whisper that wasn't part of the usual static hum of the room. It was different. It was a call, soft, faint, and yet undeniable. I turned, instinctively, to the man. His eyes met mine, and for the first time since his arrival, I saw a flicker of something, recognition. He wasn't looking at me as a stranger anymore. He wasn't lost in his own spiraling madness. He was waiting. There was a brief moment where we both understood the same truth, and it filled the space between us like a thick fog. We weren't alone. And the worst part was, we didn't want to be. The whispers turned to laughter, then to a low, guttural growl. The walls seemed to pulse as though they were alive, tightening around us, the air growing thicker with every passing second. There was no time to think, no time to prepare. There was only one thing I could do, and I had done it before. I ran. It was instinct. The desperate, animal need to escape whatever force was closing in around us. But the moment my foot hit the ground, I felt it, my feet didn't touch the floor. The room shifted, pulling me in every direction, warping the space around me. The very concept of running dissolved, and I was caught, spinning, trapped in its web of nothingness. The man, he wasn't running. He was standing still, frozen, staring at me. But his eyes weren't seeing me anymore. They were hollow, vacant, like the room had taken him already. And then, I realized. I hadn't been running toward an exit. I had been running toward my own end. The temperature dropped again. Every breath I took now felt like I was inhaling shards of ice. The air tasted like metal, like something ancient and decayed. And just when I thought I couldn't take any more, I heard it, the soft creak of something heavy shifting. Slowly, like some enormous, invisible hand was pulling it into place, a shape began to form. It was a figure, human-shaped, but not human. Its features were vague, shifting like shadows, nothing that could be fixed in one moment. It was more like a collection of fear, every fear that had ever been conceived, compressed into a shape that was just enough to be recognizable. I didn't know if I wanted to scream, to run, or to curl up into a ball and pray it would pass me by. But none of that mattered. The room didn't care about what I wanted. It was feeding on the fear, the raw, primal terror of being trapped in its hold. I was being pulled toward it. And the worst part was, I wasn't even fighting it. There was something in me, something deep, deep inside, that knew this was inevitable. This was always how it ended. The figure stepped forward. Its eyes, or what could only be described as eyes, were not eyes at all. They were voids, like deep, bottomless wells that threatened to swallow me whole. And as it drew nearer, I saw it clearly, for the first time. The figure was me. Not exactly. It didn't look exactly like me, but it was my face, twisted, broken, twisted beyond recognition, but undeniably my face. It was the me I could have been, the me I feared I was becoming, and it was smiling, an expression full of teeth and malice, mocking every part of me. "You're already one of us," it whispered, its voice a low rasp, filled with despair and contempt. And that's when I realized. There was no them. There was no outside force controlling the room. There was only me. The room was a mirror, reflecting everything I tried to escape from, everything I tried to bury. Every part of myself that I thought I could leave behind. The more I fought, the more I struggled, the more I realized that there was no way out because the room wasn't keeping me inside, it was feeding on me. It had been feeding on all of us. The man who'd entered before me, the others who had come before him, we were all part of it. We had all been drawn here by our own choices, our own fears, our own weaknesses. There was no escape because we were the ones who had made the room what it was. Every lie, every mistake, every regret, it had all been distilled into this place. It was a part of us, and we were a part of it. There was no exit because there was nothing but us. The room had always been us. As the figure moved closer, I could feel the cold seeping deeper into my bones. I felt my knees buckle, my body weakening, but I didn't fall. I didn't have the strength to scream anymore. And yet, somehow, I knew. Somehow, in the very core of me, I knew this had to happen. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment the room had been waiting for. This was the moment when the walls would finally close in, and we'd all become one. The man, he was no longer struggling. He stood beside me now, his eyes vacant, his body slack. His mind had broken, just as mine had. He was just another part of the room, another shadow, another fragment of what we had once been. And in the end, it wasn't the room that had trapped us. It was us. And then, without warning, I heard the faintest sound. A door creaked open, just a whisper. And I knew. There was one last chance, one last opportunity to escape. But would I take it? Or had the room already taken everything I was? The door. The faintest creak, a sound so subtle it barely registered in my ears. But it was there, unmistakable, like a fleeting whisper from some far-off place. For a split second, I almost convinced myself that the room was finally showing mercy, that it had decided to let one of us go, me. But then, I realized something. There was no escape. Not for me. Not for any of us. I could hear it now, the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, echoing in the room. The footsteps weren't mine. They weren't the man's either. No. These were the footsteps of something older, something deeper, something that had walked these halls long before we ever had. The door creaked open wider, and I felt a chill, colder than anything I'd ever known, wash over me. It wasn't the kind of cold that freezes you, it was the kind that burns, that seeps into your very soul. It was the cold of waiting. And I stood there, frozen, rooted to the spot, my body stiff as if the air had turned to stone. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, thudding like a drumbeat that was getting slower, more sluggish. It was a sound that belonged to something dying. I didn't want to turn around. I didn't want to face whatever was stepping into the room. but I did it anyway. I turned. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a figure with human shape. It was something much worse. It was something that took form out of shadows, out of the broken places in the room. It had no face, no body that could be described. It was a thing made of pure darkness, a void that hung in the air like a forgotten memory. Its presence filled the room, its weight pressing down on me, suffocating. The shadows that clung to the corners of the walls started to writhe, twisting, reaching out to the corners of my vision. It was pulling at the edges of reality itself, making everything I knew feel wrong, like the room was no longer just a place, but a thought, and that thought was consuming me. It moved forward, and the man beside me didn't react. He didn't even seem to notice. He was a husk, a shell of a person, drifting in a sea of broken memories. I wanted to scream, to run, but there was nothing left. The air was thick with despair, with the endless pull of the room. I should have known it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. I looked back toward the door. It was still open, but it felt distant. Like it wasn't really there. The moment I looked away from the thing in the center of the room, I knew it would be gone. The door would disappear again, swallowed up by the void. But that thought, that knowledge, should have terrified me. It should have made me desperate to escape, to run to the door, to push through and get out. But instead, a strange sense of peace washed over me. It was too late. I had always been too late. I wasn't the first. And I wouldn't be the last. I was part of it now. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in place, surrounded by the suffocating blackness of the thing that had come to claim us all. Time didn't exist in the room anymore. It never had. It was all an illusion, a way to make us feel like we had control. But that was the room's trick, wasn't it? To make us believe that we could control something that was always meant to be beyond us. The whispers were louder now, crashing over me like waves, drowning me in their endless call. They had changed again, and now the voices weren't speaking in languages I recognized. They were speaking in fragments, in half-formed thoughts, like the room itself had torn apart the very fabric of our reality and was now trying to rebuild it, piece by piece, with whatever it could find. "You belong to us," the voice whispered, its tone not just cold but sickening. It wasn't a warning anymore. It was a statement of fact. And the worst part was, I couldn't argue with it. Because deep down, I knew it was true. I knew there was no escape. I wasn't just trapped in the room. I was part of the room. I had always been part of it. The man beside me was now kneeling on the ground, his eyes empty, his hands shaking at his sides. He looked like a puppet whose strings had been cut. He didn't even seem to register that he was no longer standing. The room had taken him, hollowed him out, made him a reflection of the thing it needed him to be. I couldn't help him. I couldn't help myself. There was nothing left to be done. And then, without any warning, a sound, sharp, sickening, split the air. A scream, but not from the man. Not from anyone I could see. It came from the very walls themselves, as if the room was tearing at its own seams, unraveling. The walls started to bend inward. Not in the way that a physical structure might collapse, but in the way that the very space around us warped, stretching towards something I couldn't comprehend. I tried to move, but my feet wouldn't obey. My body, heavy and cold, felt like it was sinking into the floor. It was like the room was pulling me in, not just physically, but into something deeper, something far more terrifying than mere space. It was pulling me into the nothingness behind the walls. There was no room left to breathe. No room left to exist. I could feel the man beside me shaking, but his movements were slow, mechanical. He was beyond screaming. He was beyond even caring. And that's when it hit me. We were already gone. The room wasn't keeping us trapped. We had already checked in. And now, there was no checking out. As the darkness closed in around us, as the room folded itself tighter, I felt something shift in the air again. But this time, it wasn't the room. It wasn't the darkness. It wasn't the thing that had been lurking in the corner, waiting. It was me. For the first time, I understood. I wasn't just lost in the room was lost in me, and I was never leaving. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed just a glimpse of the terror that lurks in room 307. But what if the story doesn't end here? If you're brave enough to face more chilling tales that will keep you up at night, don't hesitate. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because you never know when the next horror will creep its way into your world. But be warned, once you enter, there's no turning back. Leave a comment below if you dare, share your thoughts on what truly happens in room 307. And remember, the nightmare never truly ends, it only waits for the next soul to cross its threshold.